Stop everything you're doing right now. Last night at 9:08 p.m. local time, a projectile struck the grounds of Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant for the second time in 8 days. The first strike was March 17th. The second strike was March 24th, 8 days apart. Same facility, same Persian Gulf coastline, same plant containing tons of active nuclear fuel sitting in one of the most militarily contested regions on Earth. Within hours, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued an urgent public statement calling for maximum restraint. Russia, whose engineers built this plant and whose personnel are still working inside it, described the situation as extremely dangerous and warned that continued strikes near nuclear infrastructure could lead to irreversible consequences. Irreversible. That is the word the people who know this plant best are using right now. And as you watch this, the world is one miscalculation away from finding out what irreversible actually means on the shores of the Persian Gulf. Welcome back. What happened last night is not just another line in a war that has produced hundreds of alarming headlines over 26 days. It is a pattern. And patterns in warfare around nuclear facilities are how catastrophes begin, not how they are avoided. So we are going to go through every confirmed fact from last night's strike, the full history of what has happened at Bushehr since this war began, what the satellite imagery shows, what Russia is saying, what the IAEA is demanding, and why the combination of these facts should concern every single person on this planet, regardless of where they stand politically on this conflict. Drop a comment right now if you had no idea Bushehr had been struck twice in 8 days, because that gap in public awareness is itself part of the story. Let's start with the confirmed facts from last night, because we lead with what is verified and we state it clearly. An unidentified projectile struck the grounds of Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant on Tuesday night. The second time in a little more than 2 weeks that the facility has been threatened by the ongoing war. The projectile struck at 9:08 p.m. local time, resulting in no casualties or damage. No casualties, no damage. The plant is operating normally. Iran's authorities said there was no damage to the nuclear plant itself, nor injuries to the staff, and the condition of the plant remains normal. Those are the facts, and we state them first. And clearly, every single time, because credibility is everything on this channel, and you deserve the full picture, not the alarming half. But here's what the full picture actually shows. The development follows an earlier strike on March 17th targeting the same plant, located along the Persian Gulf coast, which also resulted in no casualties or material loss. 2 strikes, same plant, 8 days apart, both resulted in no damage, both resulted in no casualties. Both resulted in the IAEA calling for restraint, and nobody has claimed responsibility for either one. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization claimed on Tuesday that the United States and Israel targeted the Bushehr nuclear power plant with a projectile landing within the facility's perimeter. Authorities said preliminary assessments show no financial losses, technical damage, or casualties, and confirmed that all sections of the facility remain safe and operational. Iran is blaming the United States and Israel. Neither has been confirmed or denied. An unidentified weapon has now struck a live nuclear plant twice, and the world's response has been 2 IAEA statements calling for maximum restraint. Share this video right now, because the pattern of 2 strikes on a nuclear facility in 8 days is not a story that should be buried under political coverage of ceasefire talks. Now let's look at exactly how close these projectiles are landing to the reactor itself, because the distance matters enormously, and the satellite imagery tells a precise story. Following a report by the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran had notified it of a projectile incident in the vicinity of the Bushehr nuclear power plant. The Institute for Science and International Security acquired high-resolution Airbus satellite imagery, confirming a projectile impact crater 350 meters away from the power reactor. No other damage can be seen anywhere else at the complex, and the power reactor remains untouched. Currently, it remains unclear who is responsible for the attack. And in meters, that is 3.5 American football fields between the impact crater and an operating nuclear reactor. In a war where precision-guided munitions miss their targets regularly. In a conflict where the pace of strikes has been relentless for 26 days. 350 meters is not a safe distance. It is a margin that gets smaller every time a projectile lands. The IAEA confirmed that a structure 350 meters from the Bushehr reactor was hit and destroyed. The plant has one operating unit and two further Russian-designed units under construction. A structure hit and destroyed 350 meters from an operating reactor, and two more reactor units under construction at the same site, meaning there is more nuclear material, more nuclear infrastructure, more radioactive inventory in the immediate vicinity of every projectile that lands on these grounds. Hit subscribe right now because this story is developing with every passing hour, and you need to be the first to know when the next update comes. Let's talk about Russia's role in this situation, because it is the dimension that most Western coverage is seriously underweighting, and it may be the most consequential piece of this entire picture. Russia built Bushehr, Russia designed Bushehr, Russia operates Bushehr, and Russia has personnel inside Bushehr right now working to maintain the only operational nuclear power plant in Iran in the middle of an active war zone. Russia, whose state nuclear firm Rosatom built the Bushehr plant and remains involved in construction and technical support, described the situation as extremely dangerous, warning that continued strikes near nuclear infrastructure could lead to irreversible consequences. Moscow called for the establishment of a safety zone around the Bushehr site, citing concerns over the presence of nuclear material and the potential for escalation into a broader nuclear risk. A safety zone. Russia is formally demanding that the international community establish a protected perimeter around a nuclear plant that is being struck for the second time in 8 days. That demand has been ignored. The strikes have continued. And Russia is now using the word irreversible to describe what could happen if this pattern does not stop. Russia had already lodged a formal protest with Israel in recent days, delivered through its embassy in Tel Aviv after earlier strikes landed close to residential areas, housing Russian experts who help operate the facility. According to political sources cited by the Israeli newspaper Maariv, Russia stressed that the location of its personnel had been communicated to Israel in advance. Russia told Israel exactly where its engineers live and work. Russia communicated those coordinates in advance, and strikes kept landing on Bushehr grounds anyway. The implications of that sequence are something every serious analyst watching this conflict is thinking about very carefully. Drop a comment right now. When Russia describes this situation as extremely dangerous and warns of irreversible consequences, do you think the United States and Israel are listening? Tell me your honest read, because I want to know. Let's talk about what Bushehr actually is and why it matters so much, because the history of this plant explains exactly why every strike on its premises carries consequences far beyond the immediate military context. The Bushehr plant, located 17 kilometers southeast of the city of Bushehr along the Persian Gulf coast, carries a history as turbulent as the region itself. The facility was originally conceived by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who envisioned a network of nuclear power plants to free Iran from dependence on its oil reserves for electricity generation. German firm Kraftwerk Union began construction in 1975 under a contract worth billions of dollars. The 1979 Islamic Revolution halted the project, and German contractors withdrew after completing roughly half the work. Iraq then bombed the partially built facility during the Iran-Iraq War, further damaging the site. After years of stagnation, Tehran signed a deal with Russia in 1995 to finish the plant, though sustained Western diplomatic pressure on Moscow delayed completion for more than a decade. This facility survived the Islamic Revolution, it survived Iraqi bombing, it survived decades of Western sanctions and diplomatic pressure. It has been under construction, damage, reconstruction, and political controversy for over 50 years. And it sits on the Persian Gulf coast, 20 kilometers from a city of 300,000 people, in a semi-enclosed sea surrounded by some of the most densely populated coastline in the Middle East. The incident intensified concerns about the safety of a nuclear installation that sits on the shores of the Persian Gulf, where a radiation leak could pose an existential threat to neighboring Gulf Arab states that depend on desalination plants for their water supply. Desalination plants. This is the connection that most people are not making. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, do not have large freshwater rivers. They produce their drinking water from the sea. And the sea those desalination plants draw from is the Persian Gulf. the same body of water that Bushehr sits on. A radiation release into the Persian Gulf is not just an environmental disaster. It is a drinking water crisis for tens of millions of people who have no alternative source. Share this video right now because the connection between Bushehr, the Persian Gulf, and the drinking water of Gulf nations is something that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage is explaining clearly. Now let's look at the full picture of what has been happening at Bushehr since this war began on February 28th, because last night's strike did not happen in isolation. It happened as the latest point in a pattern that has been building for weeks. Since the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran began in late February 2026, multiple strikes have been reported in the Bushehr region, including attacks on nearby military targets and Iran's major South Pars gas processing infrastructure in Asaluye within the same province. On March 3rd, Rosatom CEO Likachev acknowledged that the situation at the plant was complex but under control, noting that explosions at a distance had caused minor effects such as broken windows. On March 10th, he said contact with Iran's nuclear industry leadership had been completely lost, with officials not responding to phone calls or emails. Let that detail land for a moment. The CEO of Russia's state nuclear corporation, the man responsible for the engineers working inside Bushehr, said on March 10th that he had completely lost contact with Iran's nuclear industry leadership. Officials were not answering phone calls, not responding to emails. In a country under sustained bombardment, the communication infrastructure that would allow the people running a nuclear plant to coordinate with the outside world had broken down. And into that communication void, projectiles kept landing. On March 3rd, Rosatom confirmed the precautionary shutdown of Bushehr Unit 1 and suspended all construction work at the Bushehr site. The reactor was shut down as a precaution on March 3rd. That means for the past 3 weeks, Bushehr has been operating in precautionary shutdown mode, which means the reactor is not actively generating power, but the nuclear fuel remains in place. The cooling systems must continue to operate, and the spent fuel storage is still full of radioactive material that requires active management. A shutdown reactor is not a safe reactor. It is a reactor in a different operational state that still requires continuous attention and still poses serious risks if its cooling or containment systems are compromised. But what happened next shocked even me. And this is the piece that brings the human dimension into sharp focus. The safety of human life is our absolute priority. We had previously partially reduced the number of personnel at the construction site of Bushehr Nuclear Power Plant Units 2 and 3. About 250 employees and their families were safely evacuated from Iran. Children of employees were preemptively evacuated before the armed conflict began. Russian engineers sent their children out of Iran before this war started. Before the first bomb fell on February 28th, Rosatom was already evacuating the children of its personnel from Bushehr. They knew what was coming. They prepared for it. They moved the most vulnerable people first. And they kept their engineers on site because someone has to maintain a nuclear plant even when missiles are falling around it. These are not abstract actors in a geopolitical drama. These are fathers and mothers who sent their children to safety and then went back to work in a nuclear facility in a war zone because the alternative, an unmaintained nuclear plant in an active conflict, is more dangerous than staying. Snapback sanctions triggered by the European parties to a 2015 nuclear deal with Iran are set to return by the end of Saturday. This is the piece of the puzzle that almost nobody is connecting to the Bushehr strikes right now. On Saturday, March 28th, European nations are reimposing UN sanctions on Iran that were lifted by the 2015 nuclear deal. The timing is not coincidental. As diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran is supposedly underway, as ceasefire talks are happening through Pakistani and Omani intermediaries, as Trump is claiming a deal is imminent, Europe is simultaneously reimposing sanctions. The diplomatic picture is not unified. The pressure from multiple directions is simultaneous, and Bushehr is being struck in the middle of all of it. Stay till the very end, because the prediction I am about to give you is the one that every nuclear safety expert and every serious geopolitical analyst converges on right now, and it is more important than any single strike update. Let's look at what the IAEA chief has been saying consistently since this war began, because his words represent the considered judgment of the organization whose entire mandate is preventing nuclear catastrophe. IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi stated, "I reiterate my call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint to avoid further escalation." Let me again recall past General Conference resolutions that state that armed attacks on nuclear facilities should never take place and could result in radioactive releases with grave consequences within and beyond the boundaries of the state which has been attacked. To achieve the long-term assurance that Iran will not acquire nuclear weapons and for maintaining the continued effectiveness of the global non-proliferation regime, we must return to diplomacy and negotiations. Should never take place. Those are the words from the head of the UN's nuclear agency, speaking about attacks on nuclear facilities. Not should be limited. Not should be proportionate, should never take place. And Bushehr has been struck twice in 8 days. The gap between what the IAEA chief is saying and what is actually happening on the ground is the most alarming single fact in this entire story. Now, here is the prediction that every expert watching this situation from a nuclear safety perspective agrees on. The current pattern cannot continue indefinitely without an accident. Not because anyone wants an accident, not because any party is deliberately targeting the reactor, but because the mathematics of probability do not cooperate with military operations. Every additional strike in the vicinity of Bushehr is another roll of the dice. 350 meters today. What is the distance tomorrow? What is the distance next week when peace talks are still underway? Snapback sanctions have just been reimposed. The 82nd Airborne is arriving in the region, and nobody has claimed responsibility for either of the strikes that have already happened. Russia described the situation as extremely dangerous, warning that continued strikes near nuclear infrastructure could lead to irreversible consequences. In the days that followed, Moscow called for the establishment of a safety zone around the Bushehr site, citing concerns over the presence of nuclear material and the potential for escalation into a broader nuclear risk. A safety zone. The country whose engineers are inside that plant, whose CEO has lost contact with Iranian nuclear officials, whose children have already been evacuated, is calling for a protected perimeter around Bushehr. That call has been made. The strikes have continued. And the margin between the impact craters and the reactor is 350 meters. The world is not watching this closely enough, and this channel is going to keep covering it until that changes. Now, I want to ask you the 3 questions I ask at the end of every video, because your answers are part of the public record of how people responded to this moment, and because these questions genuinely matter. Question A. What would you do right now if you had the power to act? Would you push for an immediate international ceasefire specifically to protect Bushehr and other nuclear facilities in the region, even if it meant Iran retains some of its existing nuclear infrastructure? Or do you believe the military campaign must continue regardless of the proximity to nuclear sites? Tell me exactly what you would do in the comments, because every answer matters. Question B. Who do you trust to protect the world from a nuclear accident in this conflict? The IAEA, which is calling for maximum restraint but has no enforcement power? Russia, which built the plant and is warning of irreversible consequences? The United States and Israel, neither of whom has acknowledged striking Bushehr? Or nobody, and you believe the world is simply hoping the margin of 350 meters holds? Question C. Will you speak out about what is happening at Bushehr right now? Not about the politics of this war, not about who started it or who is right, just about the simple fact that a live nuclear plant on the Persian Gulf coast has been struck twice in 8 days, and the drinking water supply of millions of people depends on that sea staying clean. Will you be someone who makes sure this story stays visible? Here's where we are on March 25th, 2026. Bushehr has been struck twice in 8 days. The impact craters are 350 meters from the reactor. The plant is in precautionary shutdown, but still contains tons of nuclear fuel requiring active management. Russian engineers are on site, and Russia is warning of irreversible consequences. The IAEA chief says attacks on nuclear facilities should never take place and is calling for maximum restraint. Snapback sanctions return on Saturday. The 82nd Airborne is arriving in the region, and nobody has claimed responsibility for either strike. This is not a story about politics. This is a story about physics. And physics does not negotiate. If this video gave you the full picture that the headlines did not, please share it right now. Every share reaches someone who needs this context today. Hit subscribe so you are the first to know when the next development at Bushehr is confirmed. And drop a comment below because your voice in this conversation is part of how the world responds to this moment. We cover this because it matters. We cover it with verified facts because that is the only journalism worth having. And we will keep covering Bushehr until either the strikes stop or the world pays the full attention this situation deserves. I will see you in the next one.